So continuing on in the Solipsism series, we will now pause to consider a suggested association between radical empiricism and solipsism. The idealist philosopher George Berkeley argued that physical objects do not exist independently of the mind that perceives them. An item truly exists only as long as it is observed. Otherwise, it is not only meaningless, but simply non-existent. The observer and the observed are one. Berkeley does attempt to show things can and do exist apart from the human mind and our perception, but only because there is an all-encompassing mind in which all ideas are perceived. In other words, God, who observes all. Solipsism agrees that nothing exists outside of perception, but would argue that Berkeley falls prey to the egocentric predicament. He can only make his own observations, and thus cannot be truly sure that this God or other people exist to observe reality. The solipsists would say it is better to disregard the unreliable observations of alleged other people and rely upon the immediate certainty of one's own perceptions. And so, what to make of these assertions? Well, one notable observation that comes to mind right away is that although these statements might have their heart in the right place, some of their conclusions are predicated upon erroneous assumptions, and others upon distancing externalizations. So let's dive right into it then. The main problem with empiricism from solipsism's eyes is that the phenomena of experience itself is not the ultimate truth. Experience is existential, hence contextual, therefore subjective. Thus, experience's significance is realized momentarily. Ergo, its specific utility is open-ended and realized by a subject within a framework. But experience can't be the basis of knowledge, because experience itself isn't the context. You don't have experiences. You have a perception of experiences. So at the very least, perception would be a better place to base a body of knowledge. And while it's true that knowledge can be derived from sense experience, it isn't true that said knowledge is a description of the fundamental truth either. Knowledge at best deals with the ins and outs of falsehood, at least when it comes to compiling knowledge based on sense experience. Sense experience isn't the truth, nor are perceptions, nor the knowledge that is based on sense experience and perceptions. Let us not forget to ask, what is the context of sensory experience? So, just as the case with rationalism, empiricism infers and attributes reality, completely ignoring what reality actually is, and what makes existence possible. And it should be clarified that the earlier affirmation in the beginning of the rumination, that is, solipsism agrees that nothing exists outside of perception, is, in fact, a false presupposition. Much of this asseveration depends on what is meant by the word exist in this context. It's only right in the sense that existentiality is only a factor found to be occurring in a perceptual framework. So yes, nothing can exist outside of the existential. But more than likely, this isn't what was meant by the declaration. It seems to be employed here in the wrong sense, indicating that the only truth of reality is perception itself. And this is patently false, and not solipsism's position. In taking the statement literally that nothing, that is, nothingness itself, exists outside of perception, still doesn't follow, as nothingness itself can't exist as nothingness isn't an aspect of existentiality. So we can see why solipsism is a bit at odds with empiricism. So what about radical empiricism? Radical empiricism is a philosophical doctrine put forth by William James. It asserts that experience includes both particulars and relations between those particulars, and that therefore both deserve a place in our explanations. In concrete terms, any philosophical worldview is flawed if it stops at the physical level and fails to explain how meaning, values, and intentionality can arise from that. Radical empiricism is a postulate, a statement of fact, and a conclusion, says James in The Meaning of Truth. The postulate is that the only things that shall be debatable among philosophers shall be things definable in terms drawn from experience. The fact is that our experience contains disconnected entities as well as various types of connections. It is full of meanings and values. The conclusion is that our worldview does not need extraneous trans-empirical connective support, but possesses in its own right a continuous structure. James' factual statement is that our experience isn't just a stream of data, but a complex process that's full of meaning. We see objects in terms of what they mean to us, and we see causal connections between phenomena. Experience is double-barreled. It has both a content, sense data, and a reference. And empiricists unjustly try to reduce experience to bare sensations, according to James. So from this we can see why radical empiricism is at odds with empiricism. And we previously established solipsism to be at odds with empiricism for similar reasons as well. But what about radical empiricism and solipsism? Are these positions more harmonious or likewise at odds? I would lean more towards them being at odds, as while solipsism and radical empiricism agree that reality isn't just bare sensations, the addition of abstractions isn't a philosophical epiphany of a fundamental truth. Because that's all radical empiricism is seemingly adding to the mix. That mental gymnastics also play a part in the complete picture of the existential framework. I'm not so sure that this is all that radical. Maybe it was radical in 1909. But considered in more contemporary times, it's a bit of a moderate proposition. Perhaps it's radical as it applies solely as an additional criteria in empiricism to ascertain knowledge, but not as it applies in comparison to solipsism. George Berkeley basically gets it right with the argument that asserts physical objects have no existence apart from the mind that perceives them. I say basically gets it right, however, because there are a few misconceptions that follow. We can make the whole thing easier to comprehend through some analogies. Shapes in clouds have no existence apart from the clouds. Or ripples and waves have no existence apart from the ocean. But the ultimate reality of these shapes, waves, or ripples isn't the cloud or the ocean. To know the ultimate reality, we need only discern that which gives cloud and ocean their context. Some may say that the mind is the context, and while it may be true that the mind is the framework for sensory perceptions, wherein things like clouds and oceans appear, it should also be asked, what is projecting these perceptibles onto the mind? The mind is the framework for the existential, but yet the mind isn't the ultimate reality. The mind is simply the spectrum where all phenomena, both mental and physical, are represented. To regard the mental and the physical as separate is to get snared by details and get stuck on the complexity of appearances. We know all about the concept of the difference between the mental and the physical, as well as the concept of individuated clouds, oceans, and the people therein. But believing these concepts to be objectively separated factors is to forget the framework of the mind, and furthermore, the source of the mind. Taken from another angle, if you think about it, the conception of separation is based purely on the ideas about the limited confines of a visual medium. The idea of separation in a unified field is a visual illusion, facilitated by the way the attention is fooled into applying its focus, in much the same way as one might believe images on a photograph to be depictions of separated objects contained in a space, while, in fact, this distinction is really only a visual discernment derived from a unified field of pixels. So, again, the trick in revealing the underpinning of this illusion is a matter of selective focus and redirecting the attention. So the parts in Berkeley's assertions that are in need of some more elaboration and clarification concern unobserved phenomena. Just because an object isn't being visually observed doesn't mean that the object doesn't exist and is meaningless. There is a continuity and constancy to the overall idea of objects and the exact condition of specific established objects. If you want to really learn how existential experience works, then you need to take the approach from idealism and understand that you are dealing with the rules of mental composition. It's not physical composition, as we've been told to believe. The physical is simply a dense property of the mental, just as ice could be said to be a dense property of H2O. Knowing this, we can begin to understand the groundwork for mental composition. And this is where the implications of quantum mechanics will be of some assistance. Now, to be clear, it should be understood that the entire contention and all the related controversies surrounding the heated debate on quantum mechanics boils down to one thing, and one thing only: whether or not reality is a creation of the mind. It's never directly stated this way, as there is a great deal of interest in convolution for the sake of diversion and maintaining a falsehood through confusion. But it can honestly be boiled down as such. Where people fall in their interpretation of quantum physics depends on whether they are taking the approach with idealism or with materialism, i.e. the externalization mindset. And needless to say, if they are taking the externalization mindset, they are taking the old, outmoded, erroneous approach. Bearing this in mind, it appears that one of the laws of mental phenomena, whether abstract or concrete, is, once potentiality has collapsed into a set possibility, the extant phenomenal content begins its transformative journey towards its eventual inevitable extinction. So there is potential, manifestation, development, decay, and then a return to potential. Concepts and objects have different specifics related to their shelf lives, trajectories, and extinctions, but they both still follow the same basic rules. So an unobserved object is still in the realm of the existential and has a subjective meaning associated with it. Granted that a meaning is just an abstraction, but if objects didn't somehow retain their imagined templates when unobserved, then an object would not have to follow any rules, hence would not hold true to a model existentially when not being observed, perhaps reappearing in different configurations randomly upon every subsequent observation, and its relational significance would have to be relearned every time it re-entered the field of perception. So what is the glue that binds objectified continuity and the subjective organization of abstractions associated with it? This is where Berkeley attempts to show that reality is existential beyond the human in some all-encompassing mind, such as the God figure, that perceives all ideas. But there's no need to attribute the apparent rules of sensory perception phenomena to an external factor. Human mind, all-encompassing mind, God mind. What exactly do these classifications represent in reality? Why so spooky and ambiguous? If reality is pure awareness itself, then attributing reality to a mind is an externalization. And saying physical objects do not exist independently of the mind that perceives them doesn't clarify exactly the nature of this proposed mind, leaving much to be presupposed by an existential explorer. The most common pitfall befell when assuming this proposition is clasping onto the identifier of mind, which, when followed through with an externalization mindset, winds up becoming attributed to a brain, thereby casting power and responsibility onto an inventory item. And this is an ineffectual conclusion, and partially contradictory, as the brain itself is a physical object. Berkeley said an object doesn't exist and is meaningless when unobserved. So wherein can the brain be existing when it is very rarely observed? So by this logic, the mind cannot be the brain. The brain, as a physical object, doesn't exist independently of the mind that perceives it, remember? Ah, yes. So this is where it can be known that the mind and the brain are not synonymous. Brain is yet another pattern in the program. So if not the brain, then what is giving the program context? What is the mind? It's been called nothingness, superposition, the spirit, or pure potential. But it's significant to understand that it isn't a phenomena found in sensory perception. That's the problem always run into when the source is given a label. The tendency to want to project it outwards onto the extrinsic by thinking of it as some type of spatial locality or outside entity. So to call reality awareness is a better way to allude to it, but just keep in mind that awareness isn't existential. Therefore, it cannot be found represented as anything in sensory perception. This is more in line with a more clarified definition of what's being referred to with the label mind. But this confusion is exactly why the term mind is an insufficient classification. But when we hear that an item truly exists only as long as it's being observed, and that the observer and the observed are one, does this bring us any closer to finding out the true nature of the mind? Unfortunately, not really. The observed only exists while it's being observed, and yet the observer and the observed are also one? Okay, so what's observing? Who is the observer? If the observer and the observed are one, then can any observable object ever be considered non-existent just because it is not being observed by that which is one and the same? It's an incomplete, unclarified explanation. Without explicitly stating so, this seems to indirectly suggest that the observer being referred to here is the ego. What else can one conclude when a philosopher uses a term like observer? But this really doesn't wash, as the ego, as commonly understood, is represented as a physical body, and a physical body is an object. If a physical body is an object, it is existent. How is it finding its state? What is observing the observer? And I suppose this brings us to Berkeley's subsequent theorem, that things can exist independent of a human, due to some all-pervading universal God-mind apart from the human vessel that observes everything. I guess this is a bit of a philosophical deus ex that neatly ties up any possible loose ends, no? The only problem is, observer relates to the visual. Sooner or later, one will have to face up to the fact that the source of reality is not represented as anything found in sensory illusion. This is why we should also be careful when we say that something is non-existent. Save for nothingness itself, there really is no such thing as non-existent phenomena. When an object isn't being directly observed, it's still an existential object. It just isn't the current target of focus. And things like fantasy and fiction are not non-existent, because they find their ground within abstractions. A unicorn, for example, is existent. It just isn't a physical phenomena. A unicorn is strictly an imaginary phenomena, but it is still an aspect of existentiality nonetheless. And lastly, what about the suggestion that Berkeley is falling prey to the egocentric predicament, that he can only make his own observations, and thus cannot be truly sure that God or other people exist to observe reality? Well, the problem here seems to stem from the externalization mindset predicament more than anything else. The lock of egoic identification is something that cannot be overturned, save through lucid awareness. There simply is no other way. People don't observe anything. A god doesn't observe anything. These are just concepts. Don't form an identity with a periscope. You are not a periscope, and periscopes don't observe reality. Reality makes observations through a periscope. But observations made through a periscope should not be confused as reality.